and welcome to An Evening with Nirvana. It's a podcast where I talk to a series of guests from the Doom community, maybe some people outside of it, talk about level design, things like map creation, and in this case, we're talking about speedrunning. My guest today is Daerik, who you'll likely know as the first person to perform a D2 max of Sunlust, which, if you're unaware of that, it's all secrets, all kills on every map, played unsegmented in one sitting. So quite an undertaking. He also has a number of other impressive runs like D2 maxes of Valiant, Stardate 20xd6, and Ancient Aliens. He's the king of D2s, really. How are you doing today, Daerik?
I'm doing pretty good, Nirvana. How about yourself?
Not too bad. It's nice to be asked, you know? I feel like a lot of the time the guests, they don't ask. What's up with that?
But why? You gotta ask. It's your show.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's nerves. Very nervous to be on such an incredible podcast.
True. I'm nervous right now.
Oh, I wouldn't be. You've seen my setup. It's not a professional environment, so I wouldn't.
I'll try not to.
So, I'm sure if you've listened to the podcast, you know what question is coming. It's the boring one. It's what was your initial introduction to Doom?
My initial introduction to Doom, I don't honestly remember. I've played it on and off since I was a kid. I didn't really get into custom mods until 2018 or 2019, thereabouts. That's, I think, when I really seriously started playing Doom more regularly. I think it was a co-op playthrough of Valiant with my older brother.
Right.
So
you didn't have that initial, playing Doom sort of around the time when it came out as a kid? Did you do that, or like?
Yeah, but not too much.
So not a lot of playing through the iWads and stuff religiously, and then and that sort of thing. It was when you primarily got into Doom, it was like P-Wad content when you were a bit older.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Valiant really being the first one I played. I think we also did Back to Saturn X, maybe? It's too far back for me to really remember. But once I seriously started playing it, one of the first WADs I really checked out of my own volition was Swim with the Whales, which is a interesting place to really start. It's going from the iWAD stuff to something like that. It's such a stark contrast in the atmosphere and the aesthetics and the difficulty.
Yeah, for sure. It was actually the first PWAD that I ever streamed, Swim with the Whales.
Ooh.
So I had a similar experience.
I immediately fell in love with it. It was such an amazing package for me at the time. And I don't know, I just went from there, played a bunch of other well-regarded WADs, Eternity, Ancient Aliens, stuff like that.
Yeah, Swim with the Whales was a huge thing for me as well. I'd seen Mega Blast streaming that, and the level of difficulty in it was like, oh, I gotta see if I can... I was still a keyboard-only player at the time.
Ooh.
And so I went into Swim with the Whales as a keyboard-only player. And it's a challenge.
That sounds rough.
Yeah. Well, I had a pretty weird trajectory of keyboard-only into controller into keyboard and mouse.
Ooh, controller.
Yeah. So I beat Swim with the Whales the first time through with controller. And same with Sunlust, Sunder, all those big WADs.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. It makes you good at slowly sidestepping projectiles.
Ooh.
So what was your in terms of speedrunning, was Doom your first speed game, or had you sort of dabbled in other games?
It's basically my first actual speed game. I did, again, I don't remember how long ago this was, but I did some like casual Shovel Knight speedruns with a friend,
Uh-huh.
or races rather, not speedruns. But Doom was really the first thing that I ever uh, got into speedrunning for, and I didn't initially intend to really be doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well,
For me,
oh, sorry, you go.
I was a big competitive multiplayer person, playing things like Overwatch, Rainbow Six Siege, Dota,
Dota.
those sorts of things, and I just around I got frustrated with the state of a lot of them. So I just sort of went to playing single player games for a while, and Doom was a good fit for that. I was streaming of Eternity BAP 32 when Yukiro had showed up in chat to talk about things.
Uh-huh.
Um, and this was like my second streamed playthrough of Eternity, and I was doing it without mid-level saves, which was something relatively new to me, but it seemed like an interesting challenge. And we got to talking about saveless playthroughs of things, other WODs, and I don't remember exactly how, but he talked about Nevanos looking at doing Sunlust without saves, and I, at the time, thought that was impossible.
Yeah.
But I was interested, so I checked out Nevanos' stream, and he was working on Paradise D2All, and that seemed like an enjoyable challenge to me, not necessarily a speedrun, just a challenge run.
Yeah.
And I gave that a try myself and enjoyed it a lot, and that sort of really got me hooked into actually doing other runs. So I did Valiant, and then I looked for something else to do, and then I did Ancient Aliens, and then I started looking at Eternity, but Eternity wasn't that enjoyable to run.
Uh-huh.
But I looked for progressively harder things to work on from there. So after doing Valiant and Ancient Aliens, I asked myself, what's next? And Sunlust ended up being the answer.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a fun process of trying to even determine for my own sake if it was possible. Looking at, I think I started with map 21 and just did a segment of 21 through 30 and then kind of worked backwards like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll definitely get into the details of that run a bit later on. It's interesting you talk about Nev as being one of your first sort of introductions to like speedrunning, like harder content and stuff. Because I suppose I always think of you as being more inspired by Zul, who was streaming a lot, I think, at the time. And
I never really casually browsed the Doom category on Twitch up until I started doing runs myself.
Uh-huh.
And the only reason I really found Nevanos was just because Yukiro had mentioned him.
Ah, I see. Okay. I think I just remember when I sort of first tuned into your stream, you had sort of the keyboard, like the same sort of keyboard and mouse cam setup that Zol had, and definitely similar vibe, and you were sort of speedrunning harder stuff. And I suppose sort of later down the line, a lot of talk about Zol's maps, dimensions, and things like that. So I'd always thought of you as sort of maybe following in Zol's footsteps a little bit. Especially also, I think you also ended up speedrunning Entropy and Miasma and a few of the runs that I had sort of known him for his records.
Mm-hmm. I've definitely had people make comparisons to Zol in my called me like a Zol clone.
I don't know about a clone, but
well, yeah, I mean, I don't see it as a bad thing. I enjoy Zol as a player. He enjoys the same content I enjoy, and I don't know. I don't see it as a bad thing to be called a clone of him.
sure. Well, I mean, he is a pretty exceptional player for sure, and a good mapper too. So speedrunning for you was sort of like a competitive outlet in a single player setting in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Yeah. And do you find that like you tend to be competing with other players when you speedrun, like trying to take their times, and do you like that leaderboard aspect, or is it more about sort of just competing with yourself?
Definitely just competing with myself. I don't have much of a drive to really compete with other people anymore after getting burned out by competitive multiplayer games.
What sort of specifically do you think? You said the game sort of, like you sort of didn't like the direction they were taking and stuff. Was it
Uh,
something within yourself that you didn't enjoy about like the experience, or was it specifically like you didn't like new patches coming in for games and things like that?
Yeah, I guess mostly updates towards the competitive games that I really played sort of steered the direction of them away from individual agency into more of a emphasis on the team as a whole doing well. And uh, I don't know. I don't enjoy that so much. I don't enjoy trying to mentally rally everyone to stay untilted to play their best.
Yeah. As a
I
fellow
just
Dota player, I understand the sentiment.
oh man, Dota is awful for that.
Yeah.
You die once as a mid laner, oh, your team is AFK in the fountain.
Yeah. Well, Dota's a problem because the games are much longer on average than other competitive games. So if someone tilts minute 10, you're stuck with them for like 40 minutes a lot of the time.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
That's a rough one. But
Yeah,
very high highs and low lows is how I always put Dota 2. So
yes, I agree with that. Oh man. I have a lot of memorable days of playing heroes like Meepo and Invoker.
no, you're a Meepo player, jeez.
I was attracted to the mechanically difficult heroes to play
Yeah,
because I enjoy that challenge.
yeah. Meepo, I don't think I've seen Meepo in my games for a very long time, or in competitive or anything. He's just like not a hero anymore, so that'll make you a bit sad. Good
That's
reason not to
upsetting.
come back to Dota though.
I never planned to.
That's fair. So you've sort of become known for detours. I feel like I was aware of the category. I think I'm not sure if Zol had actually done any, but it was something we'd talked about a decent amount. Just the detour as a concept. What made you want to start speedrunning WODs in that format?
Well, again, it was initially about the challenge instead of the speed.
Yeah.
And I see longer demos like that, either not having a previous record or not being hyper optimized. It tends to be easier to just sort of do it and get a time you can be happy with. Whereas if you try and do like a 3 or 4 minute max, they tend to be hyper optimized, face plant everything.
Yep.
So I was drawn to just more of it being a challenge run instead of a speed run. I didn't have to worry about optimizing it because nobody else had ever done it before.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting for sure. I mean, a lot of the IL runs for like the bigger WODs, I mean, especially the IWODs, are very like they become more and more RNG dependent, I guess, as the times get shorter and shorter because like you can only execute so much, and then you become a little more reliant on the game to be kind of kind to you, I think.
Yep, I remember watching Zol stream Sunlust Map 28, and it eventually devolved into just hugging cybers, hoping you could two-shot them without getting killed.
I remember watching him do that run, and that one cyber demon that's sort of stuck on that little teleport platform that you have to BFG after the Baron Vile pit. That one
The
was
block
always
map cyber demon.
yeah, that was always the big sticking point of the run, I feel like.
Yep.
So when I spoke to Vile about like detour routing in speedruns, he sort of suggested that one of the major components of the routing process that is sort of different from individual level runs is ammo management in the case of usually cells for the BFG, because often in a detour wall you're trying to get BFG as quickly as possible and then route your cells around that. Can you think of anything else specific to detour wall routing that makes it kind of a unique routing experience?
I see ammo management just in general being the big thing to really actively be thinking about. Um, Cells, obviously, using plasma on earlier levels versus saving it for a BFG that you get later. And rockets are the two things you can really route better than an IL can.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also obviously the trade-off of how aggressive your routing is. In the D2L, do you lose 10 seconds to make something 3 times more consistent?
Yeah, and I mean, I was curious about that, because that was something else I talked to Vile about, was sort of like the aesthetics of a run, and like how important in a run like Sunlust or any other long detour wall is it to make sure that the run looks good, like when you have the finished product.
That's... If you had asked me that before I had done Sunlust, I would have said it's not that important compared to just getting an exit. But now that I have had some experience running and have accomplished a lot of what I've actually wanted to accomplish already, I think I'm at the point where if I'm going to do a run, I want it to look as good as it possibly can.
Yeah.
Like when I was just revisiting Sunlust, rerouting it for a second D2 all, I did a lot of stupidly aggressive strategies that probably won't work out, but if they did, man, it would be impressive to watch.
Yeah, and I would imagine like a time save too.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think Sunless has some notable ones, because there are cheesier, safer strats you can do. I think 29 is the one that sticks out for me in terms of being able to sort of hide using that Soul Sphere secret to kind of cheese the final fight. You can do that and the fight goes by really slowly, or you can sort of tackle it head on and you end up doing it a lot quicker, but it's obviously way more dangerous that deep into a run.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Doom, we sort of touched on RNG a little bit, and Doom has a decent amount of RNG in terms of like damage rolls, especially. Sort of how do you go about trying to mitigate RNG, do you think, when running Doom?
When it comes to damage rolls, I've always had the mentality that if you take an 80 damage Rev Rocket, it's not RNG that fucked you over, it's you making a mistake and eating the Rev Rocket in the first place.
Yeah.
And when it comes to outgoing damage, like with rockets, prepare for low rolling as much as you can. Like, expect vials to live for rockets and play around that. Be prepared to have to play around that. Don't just hope that they die in 4. I think it's something that you just have to proactively manage.
Mm-hmm. I think it's something I've actually noticed with better players, is that, like, let's say they're running a map that has a lot of rockets in it, and they know they're going to have enough rockets for the whole map. You'll notice that they will just fire that 4th rocket automatically for a vial or something, even if it may take 3 or whatever. And it looks inefficient if you don't know why they would do something like that, but it is certainly something that I've noticed better players do.
Yep, it's just one of those proactive things. It's just sort of covering your ass.
Yeah, and it doesn't lose you any time to fire that extra rocket frame or whatever, really.
Well, it could lose you time to wasting a rocket down the line, but that's negligible versus eating a 90 damage Archvile zap.
That's true, yeah. So for UV maxing, obviously, you have to get 100% secrets, which is sort of part of the category. Can you think of any specific instances where routing secrets specifically was like an obnoxious part of the run? Or a challenging part of the run?
Any run in particular, or
Just yeah, any time in particular. I suppose for me, what came to mind was maybe God Machine, just because you do have to go a little bit out of your way, for instance, for some of those.
I think God Machine's pretty straightforward on that front with how I had ended up routing the fights.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think of the big maps that I've ran, like Miasma and Mutabor and of Eternity 32, where those maps have things tucked away all over the place.
Yeah.
Uh, that's those sorts of maps are interesting to route. It's a lot of examining things through as many different perspectives as possible and trying it out and constantly iterating.
Hmm.
Uh, just, I think I spent like a solid week way back when I was working on Eternity 32, just constantly, completely changing the route every time to see what ended up working the best.
Right.
And I find that enjoyable.
Oh, there's very tangible gains to be had from doing something like that. For a map that long, like if you completely rerouted, you might see like, like a 10, 15 minute difference or something, I would imagine, in your time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would suppose that like in the instance of secrets, there's some amount of like, how can I be in the correct area at the correct time to capitalize on being able to get this secret while also handling like an encounter kind of thing.
Mm, I'm trying to mentally refresh myself on Miasma and Mutabor specifically, because a lot of those secrets would sort of exit into a completely different direction from where you necessarily wanted to be otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course.
And that complexity is, it feels like it's just one big puzzle, and after looking at it long enough, you can eventually find something that feels like it clicks really well.
Uh-huh.
And then you could have somebody else just take a look at it way down the line and find a completely different solution to it that ends up being much faster. And I think that sort of thing is really fun about Doom runs, because they're not just trying to execute the same thing you did slightly better. They're trying to put their own personality on the run, their own spin on things, doing their own route, their own strategies for fights. That flexibility is a very cool thing about Doom that other speed games don't really have.
Do you think also that it's a bit more specific to like the longer runs too? Because you're gonna see, like let's say there's an IL run in an Ironwood. Someone routes it ever so slightly more efficiently maybe, and they get like they shave off a second off the time. But if you do the same thing with something like Miasma or a detour route, it could be a difference of maybe a couple of minutes or like even 10 minutes or 20 minutes or something in a longer run.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's definitely more. I don't want to necessarily say exclusive, but it's definitely more characteristic of longer runs that sort of thing is possible.
And do you think that makes it like a little more satisfying in a way? Do you think that's part of the reason why you enjoy them so much?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm not just like copying what Zol or Ancalagon did for a run. I'm able to just look at it with a completely fresh perspective and find something better.
Hmm. And for something like for Ancient Aliens specifically, can you think of any like key points of routing Ancient Aliens? Because it is like a bit of an easier run, I suppose, than some of your others in terms of the overall difficulty, but were there sort of particular challenges?
I always struggled with the first 4 or 5 maps of Ancient Aliens because if you want to do them efficiently, there is a lot of zerking everything,
Right.
which is inconsistent, especially for a movie demo.
Mm-hmm.
And having to weigh that time save that you could gain by zerking things against the massive loss in consistency. That was always something I struggled with, and I initially at the time settled on just trying to zerk every map, even though I could spend 2-3 hours resetting the first 3 maps in
Right.
a session of attempts. Uh,
And I suppose something else that's maybe a little unique to D2Ls is that it has kind of an odd curve in difficulty. I feel like it's sort of like, or like different peaks and troughs and stuff, because like for a map like for a world like Sunlust, for instance, you have to play like a lot of the early maps fairly straight, and then when you get your first BFG is often where the run like really opens up in terms of being able to sort of do some of the later encounters in much simpler ways than you would be able to in an IL run.
Yep, I agree with that. Watching other people do D2Ls like David, when he was working on 20x7, you'd see him stuck on map 1 and 2 for quite a while. A lot of D2Ls just have those earlier maps be sort of jails that keep you stuck in them for a while.
And I think what was particularly interesting watching you do Sunlust as well was that because you got so much better at those early maps and so much faster, you ended up resetting a lot more on like map 1 and some of those other early maps, for instance, when you felt like your time wasn't as good on those, like you wanted to start getting a good time for them, and then that sort of altered how the run was being performed in real time.
Yep. I have this mentality. I still think I have it, in that I think the first level of a D2L should be as immaculate as it possibly can be. Because most people are probably only going to watch the first level, or the first couple levels, maybe skip ahead to an infamous level way later in the set. But I really overvalue a strong introduction with a D2L.
No, I think that definitely makes sense. And I suppose when you're doing one of these runs, you are thinking about the final product and like that people are going to be watching it. It's not necessarily like just for yourself.
Yeah.
So I mean, we've talked about the length of these D2L runs. What are the strategies that you sort of built up over time of doing a bunch of these runs, just dealing with the sheer length and amount of time needed for these runs, and the fact that like you could lose a run several hours in and have to restart from the beginning?
When I was working on Valiant and Ancient Aliens and Sunlust, if I didn't have enough time to actually grind out attempts, I would still force myself to perpetually practice everything. I may only have 2 or 3 hours after I got off work to spend on it. I would just practice to make sure I was uh, still prepared for any time I had for attempts. And then when actually sitting down to do attempts, being able to gauge my own mental state was an important part of that. If I didn't feel good about attempts in the first 30 minutes, I would just stop running, even if I had 6 or 7 hours left in the day to really comfortably be able to dedicate towards it.
Yeah, that it does seem like the mental aspect of doing those longer runs must be I mean, because they're so grueling, it must be a pretty important thing to keep in check.
Yes. There were times where while I was working on Sunlust, I let bad moods get to me a lot more than I should have. And I don't know, I had some destructive thinking around that time. Like 3 or 4 months into the grind and still not getting the exit, I felt like I was a bad player and somebody else could have already had done it by now, and that sort of shit that I'm sure
Right.
people struggle with. And on top
Mostly
of
in
that,
Dota
well,
2.
yeah. On top of that, like streaming these runs, it's also doubly important to really keep yourself in a good state of mind. Otherwise, you may channel that negativity towards people watching.
Yeah. I did want to talk about the sort of streaming element of Sunlust a bit later on, but
Okay.
for now I will bring us back to Eve Eternity Map 32, which sort of notorious for its length, and you did touch on it a little bit, but what was like the original impetus for wanting to run that map specifically? Was it just the length?
Well, it started from me having looked at Eve Eternity D2All as the thing to follow up Ancient Aliens with, and just going through the routing process for all that. I spent a lot of time looking at Map 32 and found it very enjoyable. And I think that was one of the first ILs I ended up doing. I'd have to look at my YouTube upload history to confirm. Yes, that was the first IL I had ever done. And it was just that complexity of looking at it and routing it and constantly having things to tinker with. It was the same thing that made D2Ls appealing to me, but on a smaller scale.
Yeah. And I mean it's not a particularly challenging map, like especially compared to the stuff that you usually play, but the length obviously makes mistakes very punishing. Do you have to do things during a run like that to like not get too comfortable in like these easier runs, because they may have a couple of dangerous spots later on, especially if you're going quickly, and then you could lose a whole run?
No, I don't. I don't particularly have anything I have to do for myself to stay focused. I feel that's something that I excel at pretty well. That's why I like to. That's why I'm gravitate towards these longer runs. Is I am very good at staying focused on a run and staying uh, mentally on point for an extended period of time.
Yeah, because I mean, yeah, I suppose like there are definitely certain maps where you could get dropped into like a pit of chain gunners later on or something, but I suppose like just being mentally prepared and having practiced it, that's something that you don't have to worry about too much.
Mm-hmm.
So I again when I spoke to Vile, we talked a little bit about the demo system for Doom, and I suppose like what do you think some of the positives and negatives of the demo format are, and sort of how Doom speedruns are structured around it?
I think with this is more recent stuff, I guess, but the advancements that DSDA Doom itself has made, uh, it's allowed you to watch demos and be able to break down exactly what's happening. Looking at a run somebody else has done, if they're doing a trick, you can pull up their exact set of inputs and be able to figure out why what they're doing works through that. And you also have the freedom to look at them doing fights through a variety of perspectives. You're not just locked to their first person view. You have the freedom to go and look at anything while they are playing. And on top of that, I think it's also a phenomenal resource for yourself to record demos and look at how things are playing out in a map. Like just being able to go back and look at that after the fact is cool. I think it's a phenomenal system for being able to learn, as long as you know how to really utilize those tools. As far as negatives, I don't want to talk about it too much, but it's obviously something that's possible to cheat in. I mean, sure, you can cheat in any format, really, but the ways you can cheat a demo they seem easy to me.
Yeah. I guess because
And
of the sort of nature of them as being a series of inputs.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I had initially gotten into doing demos, there was some drama about somebody segmenting a movie demo and not being caught and just eventually fessing up to it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sort of thing sort of makes the entire thing pointless if people are easily able to get away with something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it must be disheartening when you're putting hours and hours into these runs. That I mean, not only because like someone's cheating and that's bad, and like maybe it's difficult to tell, but also it probably makes people wary of like other runs, like your own runs may come into question just because people have heard that people can cheat, and then it's like, oh well, maybe this really hard run, like he cheated, kind of thing.
Yeah, and that was a big component to why I stream with a hand cam initially,
Mm-hmm.
sort of to give myself that extra level of credibility.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, it does feel like there's been like quite a lot of growth in the speedrunning community more recently, I feel like. And I saw that you'd actually posted up, I'm not sure how long ago this was actually, but you'd posted up like a demo recording tutorial at some point on Doomworld. Do you think that more could be done to help new speedrunners get into the scene?
Yes, I think there is still a pretty large barrier to entry here.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Part of that is just the nature of Doom being as old as it is, being tied to the command line to really start recording a demo with the parameters that you want instead of having a nice clean interface.
Yeah.
And on top of that, Doom is a very complex game and there's a lot of nuance to a lot of tricks, like even like glides, the differences between south, west, and north and east, and what inputs you need to be able to do them, and whether or not you get stuck. And we don't really have a good singular resource to be able to read about all of that. Quite a few people have talked about taking up the mantle on improving that, but we haven't seen much right now. Miyagi had started a set of video tutorials, and I think Marabo has talked about redoing the demo recording guide thread.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully those will come out soon to really help people ease into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like it's got a slightly cumbersome recording process, and then yeah, like even just getting into the game itself can be difficult. And then there's all the different ports, and it's like, oh well, why can't I just use GZ Doom? This thing runs everything, but it's like, well, you need one with demo compatibility, and then there's sort of other things like you said, it's an old game, so you have people who've been playing this game for 15 years, 20 years, whatever. So it's difficult probably to come into the scene and improve on some of those times for that reason. But
Yep.
yeah,
Oh man, don't just new runners don't look at the IWADs. Never look at the IWADs. You'll be happier never looking at the IWADs.
yeah. I mean, that's something that's really interesting for Doom is you don't like running the base game as a speedrunner is like practically impossible. Like some of those runs are like so highly optimized that the likelihood of you beating them is like got to be like 1,000,000 to 1.
Well, it's not only that they're optimized, it's the sheer difficulty of them. I had looked at doing the Doom 2 UV Speed 1 through 30
Yeah.
run relatively recently, uh, because I was sort of interested in actually trying to do it because it's a crazy difficult run.
Uh-huh.
But I didn't know how difficult it was until I actually started looking at it. I learned a lot of new tricks in my time looking at it, and again, the cool thing about demos is looking at Looper's run. I could see exactly what he was doing at points and times to be able to make tricks work, and it is just insane how incredibly difficult and precise it is. and how optimized it is with Zero Master and Looper, and I think it was Emily who also, no, Elim, maybe, one of those, who looked at it, and they all optimized it to the point where it's at right now. And I really do see that as like the main IWAD category. I mean, you have like the episode runs for Doom 1, I guess, but for Doom 2, basically 1 through 30 is the main run to me. And compared to a lot of other speed games, there is basically no competition for it anymore, and there's no newcomers to the scene trying to take it. Whereas you look at something like Super Mario Bros. Or Mario 64, where you may have 10, 20 people who are actively running it and actively competing with one another, maybe not necessarily against the world record, but they have a lot of people actually just playing it. Whereas with Doom 2, there's nothing. And that's partially due to there being no resources for it, and it's also partially due to it being so absurdly difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely think of Mario 64, like the 120 star run, as being a fairly optimized run. Like, it's been around for a long time. A lot of people compete for that record. It's like constantly being sort of pushed. But what's interesting, like you said, is like that run, you still get new world records like coming out for that run. But I remember watching Looper doing that run on Twitch, and I had the same thought. It was like how insane the execution for that run is. And you have things like having to do that rocket jump. Like, there are a couple of rocket jumps in there that just end the run. Like, so much stuff that you have to execute on like perfectly every time.
Yeah, but like basically every trick at the later half is you fuck it up, the run's dead, you have to restart.
Yeah.
And that especially doesn't feel good after map 2 being such an early roadblock for runs, having to get that glide quickly while being shot at.
Yeah.
It's vicious. It's an absurdly difficult run, which makes it even more impressive to me after having gone through it and learning everything behind it. Just to have newfound respect for what Looper was able to accomplish with it.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of glides, I feel like speedrunners these days are getting overall a lot better at certain exploits, and they do mention things like zero presses, glides. Glides specifically can be a bit obtuse to learn. Do you have any advice for getting better at glides for newer speedrunners?
Not concisely. Again, it's something that has a lot of nuance behind it. As always, I'm going to point to pull up DSD Doom, pull up a demo of somebody doing a glide that you want to be able to do yourself, put it in slow motion, turn on show command history, and just look at their inputs, and then try and copy that. That is going to be the single best way right now to learn how to do any trick.
Yeah, I mean, like you were saying, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of nuances in terms of like gliding in certain directions and and the alignment. I believe you need mouse movement enabled, a lot of strange little factors that contribute to a glide and make it very difficult to learn.
So I don't remember the exact nuances off the top of my head, but for south and west glides, unguided, which means there's no wall on the left or the right of you to really stop your movement, you can look straight at the gap, be a little bit to the right of the center of it, hold forward, and you'll eventually get stuck. And then once you get stuck, you could use mouse movement to get through. For I don't remember if it's west or south. One of them requires move forward 2 inputs to go through, and the other you can do with move forward 1 or move forward 2. And like that kind of nuance is just, man, we really need a guide for this.
I know that there was the Doom Movement Bible or something, I think it was called at one point.
Yes.
Is that a little outdated these days?
It's accurate, but it doesn't actually tell you how to do any of these tricks. It just tells you, hey, here's how they work. Which, it's cool from a technical perspective, but it really doesn't help people do anything. I know Zero Master has a post somewhere on Doom World talking about glides pretty in depth. I should see if I can dig that up again.
Yeah, I'm curious if maybe someone could sort of take the Doom movement Bible thing and maybe like annotate it for speedrunning purposes and sort of add like, well, this is how you actually execute this in a run, and like here are some examples and things like that.
Oh, again, we have people who were, I don't know if they still are, looking at things. Miyagi in particular was working on a set of video tutorials to go alongside his practice hub map, which uh, has a lot of good coverage of speedrunning tricks. The map itself does. So if he had a good video series to accompany wow, I can't say that word. You go alongside that,
Yeah.
it'd be great. It'd be a perfect thing to point new runners at.
Yeah, right. And just on the topic of glides, it does feel like certain speedruns, like because of how powerful being able to sort of sequence break maps is with things like glides, runs will often become sort of centered around that singular glitch. Like the UV speed for map 5 of Sunder Precarious comes to mind, where the glide's right at the beginning of the map, so the UV speed simply just glides straight to the exit. Do you think there could be like some merit, like other games have, for something like a glitchless category in Doom?
No, that's sort of what the UV Max category already entails.
Hmm.
I don't know. I think the glitches are kind of what give Doom its personality. I think it's an extra level of freedom to be able to route into runs if you know how to do them and know how to utilize them. Like, what's the big Sunder map that uses Sunlust map 28 music? 16? I think it's Sunder map 16.
One of the new ones,
there,
yeah.
yeah. There's some zero presses you can do relatively early to a sort of sequence break a fight and eventually come back to it and clean it up after everything teleports in. And I think that sort of stuff is cool. I personally wouldn't want to see that disallowed in a category.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, because with Doom, we have so many maps, it's an infinite number of maps to run. That if you want to do a run that doesn't have a certain thing, you can just pick a map that doesn't feature it. You don't want to play a map with specters, you're free to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I suppose actually, come to think of it, we haven't really touched on what some of these glitches actually are. Do you think you could explain just briefly what a zero press actually is for people who might not know? Because that's certainly one of the newer tricks to do.
So my understanding is, well, I don't know exactly how it works on a technical level, but it does allow you to hit switches that are normally not accessible. Typically, it's from the side. You have to be, if you were facing the switch head on, you'd have to be to its left because one thing about Doom is uh, the imprecise nature of things means you're facing very slightly to the left. So there's a narrow position where you can hit a switch from its side because you're facing slightly left at
Interesting.
all times. Anyways, this lets you hit switches through walls, and that just lets you do a lot of interesting things to a lot of maps.
Mm-hmm.
And then, no,
And
yeah,
yeah, and glides are basically wedging yourself into gaps that are pretty much the exact same size as the player, so 32 pixels.
yes.
Yeah. Which can lead to I feel like these days mappers are pretty good about identifying like, oh, this is glidable, and we can't use 32 gaps anymore, it's banned. But if you look at a lot of older WODs, there are a lot more glides available.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting perspective on modern mapping, designing around these tricks existing, whether or not it's a good thing to allow people to break the maps with them.
Yeah, I was 2 points on that actually. One is I talked to Gazebo for the podcast, and we talked a little bit about Sunder because he's sort of come back to the project, and there are obviously a lot of like actual bugs in Sunder, and then there are sort of speedrun tricks that utilize some of these issues. Like there are a couple of big line skips in Sunder, and there's the most notorious one is what map number is it? Is it 11 maybe? There's a vile jump you can do to skip ahead and get an early BFG and stuff. And we were discussing the fact that like, well, you know, you could fix this vile jump, but the entire personality of that UV Max run, like, is that vile jump at the beginning of the map. It's what makes it an exciting run, what makes it a cool run. And obviously fixing that would just completely sort of ruin it and force you to play straight. So there's definitely like a big line in terms of what do I fix and what am I okay with people breaking, because it'll like make the speedrun interesting and make it interesting to watch.
Yeah.
So like from a mapping perspective, that's definitely something that I think about a lot when I have to fix sort of bugs. Which, yeah, I suppose was sort of notable between the two of us when you were running Fractured Worlds, and I think very last minute there were a couple of bugs that came up in map 6 that I ended up like fixing sort of towards the end, because I felt like even though they could make for an interesting speedrun, they sort of broke the map that in ways that I felt made the encounters less interesting for me personally, and like I definitely wanted them to be tackled in more specific ways. But I know that as a runner, that kind of thing can be probably frustrating on your end.
Well, I think with like Fractured World specifically, a lot of those fights are tightly designed, and that's the interesting thing about the set is it's the combat puzzle nature of it. And if you're going to run that, you're running it for the combat puzzles, not to necessarily try and break the maps in half.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it does definitely become a very arbitrary thing from a mapping perspective there, because it might just be, well, I like this in the run, but I don't like this other thing, and then you know you are just kind of fixing things on a bit more of a gut feeling kind of level.
Well, isn't that how level design is in general? Like, oh, I don't know. I spend a lot of time thinking about mapping myself because I do want to at some point in time. But
Yeah, definitely. I think you do have to maybe like try to set yourself some rules of your own personally, but you know, in the grand scheme of things, yeah, a lot of the decisions do end up being a bit arbitrary. But you could say like, oh, I don't care about glides and just leave every glide in, for instance. But then, like for me personally, I'm aware of that as a major sequence break factor, and it can lead to other problems like, you know, soft locks and things like that. So I always build around glides, but I may leave a vile jump in deliberately. Even like if Fractured Worlds has a cheesable encounter in map 4, and I deliberately left that vile jump in because I was okay with that cheese if people found it. But other vile jumps I may take out.
mm-hmm.
So yeah, definitely up to the mapper.
The same thing with like running. It's just a lot about. The same thing with like running larger maps. Is it's all about your own voice, really.
Mm-hmm.
Both from the perspective of designing things and routing things. It's just whatever you feel is correct in the moment.
Yeah, and I suppose while we're on Fractured Worlds, I'm curious, like, why you ended up sort of choosing it when you did the showcase run for GDQ.
Big part of it was its newness. Like it had just come out, so it's the perfect thing to point at as this is what the community has actively done. This isn't something that's 5 years old, 10 years old. It's new and exciting, and it showcases that these sorts of projects are still being done. And on top of that, it's just a damn gorgeous set overall. Like, every map is just aesthetically stunning, which helps contribute to that same feeling that the community is still working on these amazing things.
Mm-hmm. And I know that, I mean, the run was like pretty fresh to you for 6 and 32. What was it like kind of having to route under a time limit, really?
I don't think it was that challenging. I mean, 32 is a pretty straightforward level. There's not a lot of sequence breaking. It's just pick strategies that you are comfortable with in the fights and go from there. Mm-hmm. Map 6. Is it 6? I thought it was 7.
No, it's 6. 7 is the little outro map or whatever.
Okay. I don't have my... or rather, I'm misremembering map numbers. 6, you saw me, I think, at least, looking at a lot of different ways to route that map. And just... it's difficult to know what was correct in the moment. With not having enough time to spend endlessly working on it like I normally prefer, I just had to eventually settle on something that felt impressive and fast enough. And I don't know, it's always difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do seem to remember you ended up going with like a pretty aggressive start to the map.
Yep. What was it? Opening up the rocket launcher fight and then immediately trying to leave it and let the cyber demon infight everything.
Yep. And
I think maxes of maps like that, where you have a lot of fights with cyber demons in them, if you're able to just let the cyber demon infight things while you tackle other parts of the map, that tends to be, I want to say correct, but that's probably not the right word. It's a safe choice, in a sense, because it'll almost always consistently work out favorably.
Mm-hmm. And so we sort of touched on glitches, talking about glides and zero presses and things, and obviously the run that you're best known for, your Detour of Sunlust, wouldn't really work without several different types of glitches. The big ones are probably the line skips to avoid the death exits, which are sort of something that I'm particularly impressed about for that run, and one of the big reasons I probably would never attempt to do it myself, because I think movement is probably one of the hardest things in Doom for me. Can you talk a little bit about the process of like discovering those line skips and then implementing them?
So the line skip for the death exit on map 10 was sort of sheer luck that I stumbled upon it. Super Weapon Dude, I think is their name, had put out a task of maps 1 through 15, and they featured a line skip for the death exit on map 10, and I just randomly watched it and noticed that happened. And like that's kind of a minor thing to really notice, not dying on map 10. Like it's right next to where you would normally get teleported to die, so if you weren't paying enough attention, you could easily miss that sort of thing. Anyways, I had noticed that and began looking at trying to implement a line skip for it myself, and trying to figure out a line skip from scratch without really knowing much about the engine at the time. It just turned into 3-4 hours of brute forcing. I initially had some setup that was very inconsistent, like maybe worked 10% of the time, and I was, at the time, mentally prepared to commit to that sort of thing. But I kept looking at it anyways and found what I ended up doing for the run, which it's like 100% consistent if you just do everything correctly, and it's
Mhm.
not too complicated. Uh, the other cool trick is using the invuln for skipping the death exit on map 20.
Yeah, which involves
And
basically rerouting the entire map around it, right? Or at
yep.
least the last section of the map around it.
So initially, when I was going into that map, I was planning on using the invuln for the crypt fight, where you press the switch and a cyber demon, 4 vials, and 4 barons get revealed. Because at the time, that fight seemed terrifying to me.
Yeah.
Uh, I didn't have a lot of confidence in tackling it, and part of that's just from not being as good as I am now. And I had actually spent a decent amount of time internally debating with myself on whether or not to use the invuln to skip the death exit or not. I had eventually talked to Zol about it, and he sort of gave me the push I needed to commit to using the invuln to skip the death exit. He had showed me that just BFGing the vials in the crypt was super consistent, and kind of how I settled on actually using it. As far as discovering it, I don't believe anybody else had pointed it out to me. I think I just had a random epiphany that it would be possible because you hear the Romero head getting crushed as you get teleported in.
Right.
And I tested it and it worked, and yeah.
Hmm. Well, it's kind of interesting because Zol, uh, I know that he was the first person I saw who used the invuln for the crypt fight on map 20, because usually people use it for the fight it's sort of intended for, which is the Revenant Archvile mess immediately after the secret. And when I did my saveless run, I used it for the crypt fight. So it's interesting that Zol sort of went back and had a look at the map and decided that that was sort of a more viable thing for you.
Well, I don't remember exactly how it played out. I'm pretty sure I just talked to him about it while he was streaming, and he took a look at it for me.
Mm-hmm. And with the Sunlust detour, you talked about how you were just sort of trying to do more and more difficult stuff. Was this purely like doing that detour? Was it purely a like? Was this like you wanted to get better at the game, or was this more like I wanna like? Did you feel like you had something to prove a little bit?
Mm, neither, really. I don't tend to care about uh, what other people think of me, and I didn't necessarily have anything to prove to myself. It's just uh, seeking greater and greater challenges just because it's enjoyable is
Mm-hmm.
what really motivated me to start it.
Hmm. Well, that's a good way to look at it and a good motivation to have, I think.
I
Um,
think it's when it comes to Doom speedrunning, I think it's sort of the mentality that you have to have because you're not actively competing against other people. You're only just chasing demos, and it's always going to be easier to beat an existing time. Uh, those things, like just in conjunction, it really has to be a personal challenge. Um, how do I put it?
hmm. Well, yeah, I suppose it is like such a gigantic time sink, so you can't really be doing it for anyone else other than yourself at that point.
Yeah.
Uh, could you speak a little bit about sort of the general routing process for the WOD? Was it mostly? I mean, obviously you have these line skips which allow you to bring your weapons through, notably the BFG, into other fights. So was most of it sort of finding places where having that BFG could be used for like easier and faster clearance of encounters.
Are you asking the routing process as a whole, or routing tricks into a run?
uh, so yeah, the routing process as a whole, and what were sort of the major components of the routing process?
So around the time I was really starting it off, starting looking at everything, I focused on the safest possible strategies I could, like SSGing cyber demons on map 24. Is something that I think back on as being bad play but safe, because I just wasn't that experienced of a player back then, so I had to really focus on routing as many of the fights I could to be as consistent as possible, regardless of how long it took. I think I did like map 18 very safe, went for the Megasphere immediately, and didn't open up everything to let as much infighting happen. Just went through everything from starting with the later episodes and then working backwards. So I started with 21 and did 21 through 30, just trying to find consistent strategies for everything. And once I felt like it was reasonable and possible, I moved on to 17 to 20, and then realized the death exit thing was possible, so I did 17 through 30. And just, again, making sure everything would actually be possible before I committed to doing the early maps, because I didn't want to do 1 through 10 and then 11 through 16 and realize, oh, the later maps are impossible for me. So I just went through everything as safe as possible, and sort of how the route initially had developed. And obviously spending 6 months on the damn thing, I improved a lot as a player. I was able to be a lot more cognizant of ammo usage, especially doing so many attempts. You get a good feel for how much ammo you're going to have going into a level, or whether or not it's going to be enough or too little, and just able to decide on the fly on how to accommodate where your ammo is at.
And what's interesting about that run is that it really did like evolve over the course of you getting better at the game and getting better at the run, and it's sort of, those early maps became faster and faster. And did you sort of feel like you wanted to start pushing more and more for like the IL, maybe even the IL records for some of those, or was that just not really viable for a run like that?
Well, I did want to get the IL records, but not as part of the D2All. I wanted to do them as a separate thing at the time. I never really steered away from just focusing on pure consistency, because the combination of how long that run is and how difficult it was, if I focused on anything else, I could have still been grinding it for another 3 or 4 months. So that's, I don't know. Nowadays, if I can find the time to ever do it again, I do want to have the D2L times get a lot closer to the IL times, because I am experienced enough as a player. I've learned enough about the game to be able to actually accomplish that.
And you streamed pretty much all of your runs, maybe all of it. I'm not sure. You probably did some practice off stream and stuff, I would imagine.
Nope, I did everything on stream.
Okay, sure. And did you find that to be beneficial? I know I've talked to other speedrunners, and sometimes like comments and backseating from chat can become a real problem for them when they're trying to focus, or when they lose a run and maybe receive like, not necessarily strictly negative feedback, but people perhaps like being a bit backseaty and stuff could be seen as like a bit of a negative feedback loop for that kind of process. Did you have any struggles with that, or was it mostly like a positive experience streaming it?
So, I'll start with the good. 26. The final fight on map 26, I had gotten good advice from somebody in chat for handling it. and it made it a lot more consistent and better on ammo usage. And that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't streaming it. In general, there aren't too many moments where I feel I have been helped by people in chat, compared to getting a lot of annoying comments, annoying backseating, especially from people who don't even do these sorts of runs themselves. It's just, oh, why aren't you doing XYZ? And it's obvious if you spent even 2 minutes trying to run yourself, you'd realize why that doesn't work out. And those things can be very frustrating and tilting and upsetting and put you in a bad mood.
Yeah.
And I try and not let it get to me, but I'm only human. I do have one particularly bad example of the first run I had that made it to map 30, dying to the cathedral, and getting one of those sorts of questions of why didn't I do blah blah blah. And things got ugly on stream, I'll say that much. I'm not happy about that, and that's why I think you really got to keep your mental health in check while running on stream.
I mean, it's such an arduous run, and as somebody who, I mean, I haven't done speedruns, so, I mean, I've done like a couple of, fairly low effort ones, but, I don't stream them, it's not really part of my process or anything, but I have streamed a lot of Doom, and I've streamed like a lot of harder maps, and even as someone not speedrunning, it's incredibly annoying to to read the comments like, not even so much the ones where it's people backseating, like, oh, why didn't you do this? But there's a lot of the like, oh, like you're still here, like you're still doing this map or all this map.
Yep, God.
It's always a classic, an absolute classic. But it does get to you. Like it's really it compounds things more so than being like the only factor. Like if you're already stuck on a fight, or you're dealing with, like, I don't know, in your case, like dying deep into a run, then really those kinds of comments, they just sort of compound that feeling of like annoyance or like being tilted or whatever it is.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Luckily, it does seem to be improving nowadays. I don't see as many comments like that, at least from what I see watching other streamers.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that, actually. Maybe some sort of build-up of community around Doom with, like, discords and things like that has kind of helped. Maybe people will feel a little less, like, detached from the streamer because they're in a Discord with them, and maybe they see them talking and things like that. So maybe some of that kind of thing does help a little bit. But I do agree that I think it's gotten a little bit better, especially than when I was streaming, where it was very prevalent.
It does also help that we have so many people who stream Doom nowadays that everybody's sort of familiar with things that are frustrating to experience as a streamer, and they know not to do it themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think it's helpful. Like, you don't have to be rude about it, but it's definitely like, I think those people should be called out a little bit. Like, you don't have to be a dick. Just be like, it's not really cool to like say something like that, or
Yeah.
It becomes like a little bit self-policing once some of that happens, I think. So with the Sunlust run, like, that was a run where you can lose a run 4 hours in, because it was a 4 hour 23 minutes, something like that, what your run ended up being.
Yeah, something like that.
And so there were multiple runs that I watched. Probably not quite as stressed as you, but I was pretty stressed watching them, where you lost the runs on map 30. How attributable to nerves do you think that is? And do you think you ever get better at dealing with nerves for a run like that?
So I don't know how many runs I lost to nerves alone. I do know I lost one of the 2 runs that died on map 32 nerves during the secret Telefrag Cyber Demon fight, just because I'd already died once and I didn't want that to happen again. I was just stuck in my head, dwelling on the past and thinking about that instead of focusing on actually playing well. I still struggle with nerves during difficult runs. It, even with everything I've done, everything I've accomplished, it still is a problem for me, and I don't see that as a bad thing. I feel like it's a reflection of how much I actually care about what I'm doing, how much I actually care about getting a exit. I think it's difficult to not be nervous when you put your heart and soul into something like this.
And maybe you'd agree that perhaps part of the enjoyment of those longer sort of more difficult runs is like that adrenaline kind of pumping feeling when you're very deep into a long map or run and you're very worried about dying, but you make it through in the end, kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's a unique experience. You don't get that sort of thing out of a 5-minute or a 10-minute long run, really. Well, I guess 10 minutes can be stressful, but not on the same level.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just always having it in the back of your head, I guess, that, like, well, if I die here, back to map 1.
Yep. Yep.
Did you... I mean, this probably seems like a bit of a redundant question with an obvious answer, but, well, I suppose I can lead it into something more interesting, but, how sick of map 1 did you end up getting of Sunlust? Did you get sort of exhausted with it? I'm assuming.
God, yes. God. Oh man, out of like the 1,100 attempts or so I did, 700 of them died on map 1.
Oof.
And it's just, you can get stuck on that. Like, again, going back to what I said earlier, I wanted that map to be clean, so I didn't settle on an ugly map 1, so I would just be stuck there for multiple hours. And it's just so frustrating.
Yeah, and then do you think it helped at least that you were evolving the run a little bit and maybe like pushing yourself to get a little bit faster on those maps? Did that help to make it a little less monotonous?
Not enough, I think. There's only so many times doing the same thing over and over can be enjoyable. I just had to force myself to stay engaged with it even when I wasn't necessarily enjoying it, because you can't lose focus on a run like this or you die and then you have to restart map 1 again, and it's vicious. It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, for sure. So I know that more recently you decided to try to get the record back after Nirvana ended up sort of taking it. Is that something that you're still working on? I feel like I maybe haven't caught a stream of that for a while, or...
I'm not actively working on it right now, and that's just because of having recently started a job that's been most of my attention. I do want to get back to it at some point in time, I just don't know when I'll be able to comfortably work on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's...
Sorry, you can...
That's how I've always been with runs, is I start a lot of things up and end up having to put them aside for a while, whether because my mood for them has passed or I just can't find the time. But I will get back to it. I want to. It was very enjoyable rerouting it all and practicing it.
Mm-hmm. And is this another thing where this is something you want to, like, do you tend to want to route in isolation? Because you talk about the personality of the run being important to you, and I know that Nev, when he did the run, he was exactly the same, and he didn't really want to look at how you necessarily did things for yours. And I know that he set up his line skips a bit differently, for instance. So have you been looking at Nev's run at all for possible time saves, or are you sort of doing it in isolation and just seeing how you can improve yourself?
I have done it almost entirely. Well, no, I've done it mostly in isolation. I have looked at a few of the ILs because my time goal is well over an hour saved compared to Nevanos's run. So I don't think there is really anything I could take from the run that would be worth incorporating to hit the time goal I'm after. Whereas the ILs, there's a lot to think about there. Uh, there's a lot of potential with the hyper aggressive routing to try and get close to the IL times.
Yeah, some of them are. I don't know. Some of them are particularly detour friendly. Like a map 29 comes to mind. That run is absurdly aggressive.
Map 29 is actually pretty close from what I was looking at, I think.
Oh, okay.
Map 28, though, that's one of those maps where there's going to be some time loss, and you just it's required because otherwise it'd be too inconsistent to ever actually get an exit.
I guess for 29, I was definitely thinking about the that little like the BFG cyber section right before the vial machine. The way those are handled is it's pretty aggressive.
What does the IL do for that? Does the IL aggro all three of them immediately?
I think, yeah, just sprints in, fires BFG, tries to get like the very fast 2-shot on the first one, and then goes straight into the 2 shots on the others.
Because when I was looking at it, I was waking up all three immediately and just spamming BFG.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't going for a suicidal 2-shot on one of them, though.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you get a decent amount of cells, right, for that section, so probably pretty viable just to spam them down.
It's surprising how much more ammo there is to play with when you route the maps hyper aggressively, because they're letting a lot more infighting happen.
Are you finding that a lot of the time save is happening in the later maps, just by nature of having to usually play them a bit safer, or would it happen in the earlier maps because just of the nature of the difference between ILs and detours?
I think there's a decent blend of time saves all over. Definitely more towards the later half of the run compared to the first, but I don't know, like 1 through 16, I think I was looking at like 20 or 30 minutes of time saved.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Which, it's just much better routing, like actually taking a lot from the ILs. Especially like the first 6 or 7 maps. Heading has been looking at the ILs for Sunlust, and he did a lot of cool improvements for them that I was able to incorporate.
And I'd imagine that sort of thing is important, having other people who can look at stuff and maybe help you with tricks here and there. I know maybe not so much in Doom, but I know that in other games there are usually like people who don't necessarily run the game, but they just dedicate their time to like finding glitches.
Well, Henning, I mean, he didn't like directly help me out. He just, through the nature of improving the ILs, I was able to take a look at that and find improvements to incorporate into the run itself.
Okay, sure.
And we really don't have people in the community who specifically find improvements for other people. Really, a lot of the runners are knowledgeable enough themselves to be able to figure these sorts of things out themselves.
So, I think what was interesting for me was that immediately after sort of doing, well, I don't think it was immediately. I did think you took like a bit of a break, but it wasn't that long after that you started looking into a D2L of 20xd6, Stardate 20xd6. Was that just part of your natural like wanting to continually have like a new challenge, or do you think maybe streaming on Twitch and sort of the big YouTube response to Sunlust, you wanted to do something that may sort of match Sunlust in terms of interest as well?
It was, again, mostly just the personal challenge of looking for what's next. And obviously, after Sunlust, there's really not a lot that's above that, difficulty-wise.
Yeah.
Stardate definitely was an easier D2L, but it was still challenging enough to be enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting about Stardate, maybe even more so than Sunlust to me, is that I think of that run in terms of a D2L as pretty heavily skewed in terms of difficulty to being at the end of the WOD. Was that particularly challenging to deal with, having most of the challenge being sort of right at the end, where you're likely sort of most nervous and maybe a bit more likely to make mistakes?
Somewhat, but I was already acclimated to it from running Sunlust. I think it's, I guess, a little bit more pronounced in a run like Stardate because the last map is infinitely more difficult than anything else in the WOD, whereas Sunlust has a bit more of a gradual progression in difficulty. So in Stardate's case, it just ended up being a little bit more tedious to go through the earlier maps over and over and over.
And were you also looking at sort of IL records for Stardate 20xd6, and maybe now that you were a bit more sort of a bit of a stronger player, were you looking to match those ILs during that run, or was that not really feasible?
I think I was looking to get closer to the ILs compared to when I had done Sunlust, but I don't think I was fully at the point where I wanted to try and match them as closely as I would now. I did take the map 1 UV max record at the time I was looking at it, but everything else past map 1 I went with slower, safer strategies in places. And especially for a D2L, Stardate is interesting in that you don't get a BFG until map 7.
Right, yeah, that is interesting for a D2L, for sure.
So you can't really route the levels to be competitive with the IL times because you're not going to get as good infighting, and you don't have the BFG to really leverage the movie demo nature of it.
So I'd imagine a lot of the routing process for that would have been more around like rocket usage than cells.
Well, it does. I mean, the set does give you plenty of cells for the plasma because you're not expected to have the BFG. So you're going to have to find places to use them because you can't rocket every single encounter because it's just not enough for it. And it's the nature of the fights in Stardate make it difficult to want to try and play a fight differently from how you would in an IL to save rockets for another fight down the line, because Stardate's usually pretty good about giving you enough ammo for every fight, sometimes more than what you would need.
Right, so there aren't like potential gains from holding onto ammo from previous fights.
Yeah.
So do you think the most difficult part of the run was definitely dealing with like the big difficulty spike on the final map then, or were there sort of other challenges that you can think of for routing?
No, it was predominantly map 7. Like, I think that map sort of defined the run.
Yeah.
The difficulty of the finale and the BFG fight, and whether or not you go for the 2 consecutive archvile jumps for the red key
Yeah.
much earlier than you should have it. I think that's really all of what the run was about.
Yeah, I remember it was Zul who originally did those vile jumps for his IL run, was it not?
Yes, it
Yeah,
was.
and I think I remember watching him do it on stream and discovering it, and I was like, this seems it seems like such a ridiculous thing to do, even in an IL run, and then to do it in a D2all, definitely seems like a challenging way to do the map.
It was too cool to not include. Just,
Yeah.
I couldn't do a D2O and not have that in there.
Well, yeah, like that contributes to what we talked about earlier of the aesthetics of the run, and I suppose by this point you're a confident enough player that you probably wanted this run to like look really good.
For sure.
Well, I suppose this sort of closes out the questions that I had about speedrunning for you. You had talked about mapping a little bit, and I had seen you do mapping on stream, I think. I'm not sure what project for. And obviously, Puga's made maps for that. You talked about wanting to sort of get into it a bit more. Have you been doing some mapping in the background a little bit, or only for those couple of projects?
So I actually ended up pulling out of Poogers, but I did do maps for Dubs' 5-minute sessions, D5, DA1, and D5, DA2. Difficult. Those are interesting. It's difficult to really put together a map in 5 minutes, especially when you're not an experienced mapper. But I enjoyed putting something together for them, because an issue I've had with actually wanting to get into mapping is I am very, 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 very overly ambitious and a perfectionist, and if I wanted to actually sit down and make a proper map, I want it to be this absolutely phenomenal thing that everybody would love, and something that I could be happy with never having to touch ever again after I got it out the door. And
that won't happen.
Yeah, I know.
Tell you now from experience.
I know. It's just having only 5 minutes sort of forces you to shed that thinking and just follow your heart.
Yeah,
and
I think
that was.
Sorry, you go.
And that helped me at least get something out there and just get my own little bit of creativity out there.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the most important thing for newer mappers, is just to not only to build something but to complete something, because like mapping is kind of built up into this structured sort of process of like, it's not just building a map, like there are a lot of separate processes to it, and a big important part of that is like the completing it and then the testing it and like internal testing, and then having other people outside play it and seeing how the bug fixing process goes and things like that. And you end up learning a lot in that sort of final stage, I think. So just being able to finish something is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. I am maybe overly confident that if I were able to actually sit down and find the time to force myself to map, that I'd be able to handle all of that stuff on my own without having to send it out to anybody else to look at. And maybe that's just my own perfectionist nature talking.
Well, a lot of the testing process isn't so much like, oh, I'm a capable mapper and a capable player, so I can test it and it will be fine. It's more about different thinking. Like you put people into different situations and they will all handle it differently, and a lot of the time that's where different cheese and like different bugs and things crop up that you never would have thought of, because you generally just can't play every fight in a completely different way every single time when you're testing. So yeah, a lot of the process is helped by having other people look at it.
I don't know about that. I think that's probably true for most people, but something that I do pride myself on is being able to constantly find new perspectives to look at things, and I think that's looking back at speedrunning, that's what makes me a strong router for maps of decent length, is that I can just look at something from so many different perspectives and find a better solution.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. No way of really knowing until I actually try and get into mapping.
Yeah, for sure. I do think good players usually do make for good mappers, which is why you end up with a lot of like Slaughter Wads being like the high end of Slaughter Wads at least being fairly high quality, I would say.
Mm-hmm. That's a sentiment I definitely agree with.
Yeah, I mean, having a better understanding of the game's mechanics and how monsters move and perform in different scenarios, like it just is naturally going to make you better at like creating gameplay scenarios and stuff. So that often helps. Not necessarily always the case, but it does sort of seem to skew that way a little bit. And I would be definitely interested to see what you come up with. I'm not really sure what kind of stuff you would err towards. I'm assuming very difficult stuff, but yeah, it's always interesting to see like Zol's stuff, for instance, is incredibly tight and very clearly built, sort of specifically for his level of skill and things like that. So it'd be interesting to see if you went in that direction, or maybe like some more looser, old school Slaughter encounter kind of style, or yeah.
I don't know necessarily about encounter design that I would want to go with, but as far as overall level design, I would love to be able to emulate Tourniquet's style of these large interconnected behemoths. I have tried to think about that sort of map design, and it is so difficult to think about actually being able to put together something like that, and I have a ton of respect for his works.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tourniquet is someone that we'd all like to be able to emulate. But what's interesting about him is that he doesn't do a lot of pre-planning. Like he mostly just does everything in the editor. So, which you wouldn't really think for non-linear stuff like that. But he said that he doesn't he doesn't start working on a lot of his stuff for his maps until he's in the editor and actually just drawing lines.
Wow, that makes it even more impressive.
Yeah, he's definitely an impressive guy. So on to the final question of the podcast, which I ask everyone, and interested in your perspective on this, because I feel like usually I have a bit of a handle on it when I talk to mappers, but with speedrunners it's a bit different. What is your favorite Doom monster and why?
Favorite Doom monster? It's close between the Revenant or Archvile.
Okay, the classics.
I'm going to lean towards Revenant here, because I think they're a very versatile monster, in that they can serve as a threat in so many different scenarios. The combination of their homing projectile and their high damage output. But I think the thing that makes them really interesting to me is what they sort of force the player to do to accommodate their existence. It forces you to move in this style that other monsters don't, to be able to avoid the homing projectiles, to be able to avoid those 80 damage rockets. And for everything else in the Doom roster, it's usually just move to the side a little bit and you've dodged all of their damage. With Revenants, that's completely out the window.
Yeah.
And I I love the implications that even a single perched revenant can have on a fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had a lot of revenants as the answer, but people haven't talked about sort of their application as like a turret monster, which they're pretty good at compared to other monsters.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure also the 80 damage rolls in runs is also something that you really love about them.
Yes. I think if you eat 80 damage, it's your own fault. Get good, blah, blah, blah.
Does that mean you're sick if you eat 10 damage?
Hmm.
Because you predicted it. You bent the game to your will.
No, I mean, I could see why you could think that, but I'm definitely... If I eat even 10 damage, I think I'm a bad player.
Wow, you heard it here first. You're all bad at Doom.
It's true. Go D2 all Sunlust.
Yeah. Everyone better have a time by the end of the week.
Oh, that would be fun to watch on Twitch.
Imagine getting to backseat those people too. It'd be great.
Oh man, I would love that.
All right. Well, on that note, wonderful to have you on the podcast. It was a very nice chat, and interesting to hear your perspective on your specific runs, because I followed your Sunlust run all the way through, and I was there for the exit live, which was very exciting.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for being on, and yeah, I'll talk to you later.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, see you later.
See ya.